In this chapter, we're going to talk about yet another King's Indian structure, this time the open center. I mean, you can see the d4 pawn and the e5 pawn is missing. Most likely, black has chosen to take on d4, and then white has recaptured, and we get this structure. It's tempting to make this introduction extremely short and just say white has more space, and typically white is somewhat or slightly better here. And this is really the case. In general, when we get this structure, it's white who's doing pretty well, but not in an overwhelming way, but in a quite pleasant way. And I think we're going to see examples of this very much being true, and then we will see examples of black sort of being able to counter it. And I think it kind of sums up things. It's hard to come up with very sort of general plans. I mean, white will have a knight on d4, the knight will go to c3, and we will have bishops on e3 and either on e2 or g2. And, well, rooks belongs in the sort of semi-open file on e1 and probably on d1 in the more open file. And things just flows very logically. And it's more difficult for black in a way, and that's perhaps also why this is perhaps less popular for black in a way, that it's pretty easy to play for white, while for black you have to be somewhat of playing, I think you have to play better moves, simply. Quite a theme we will see is that quite typically when you suffer from a spatial edge, you will try to seek an exchange of one set of pieces, minor pieces for instance, and such. And well, at some point also black will get counterplay in the A file by an exchange if white plays b4 and so on and so forth. There is also, you know, sometimes if circumstances are extremely good, you can counterattack with f5. But these things are generally exceptions. I mean, black has his trumps here and there, but in general, I would like to sort of end it off as I started with. White has a spatial edge and is somewhat or pleasantly better here. And, well, it shouldn't discourage you with black. It's actually quite a popular and a necessary structure to sort of have in your arsenal if you play the King's Indian. But it's important to understand that if it's just done very voluntarily, you take on d4 with no sort of specific reason in mind, then you can end up in an unpleasant structure. But of course, knowing when things are in your favor, how you can take on d4 and use this structure to your advantage is very relevant. So we will go into the pros and cons in this chapter of this structure. In this chapter, we're going to deal with the more sort of open kind of central structure in the King's Indian. And we're starting out with a complete model game from white's perspective. It's Meyer against Feller from 2011. In the previous chapter, the sort of more close structures would happen after knight c6, and white would then play the move d5 and knight e7. Then white would get this broad center, and black would attack on the king's side. Here, black chooses a different strategy. Well, for a start, it will be possible to take on d4. We will get our structure then. This is actually how it's played very much these days. Carlsen has done it with black, for instance, and the computer seems to think that this is the preferable way to do it. But at this time, well, black would start with knight to d7 first, rook e1 c6, bishop to f1. And, well, we can see black is keeping the central structure a little bit fluid and forcing white to make moves like rook e1 and bishop f1, which you could argue is mainly useful waiting moves rather than very concrete development moves. But now black has also run out of his sort of useful moves and takes on d4, and then we get our sort of structure to discuss. I remember as a white, I always felt that, well, I was uncomfortable with where should I put my pieces. I didn't feel that there was any kind of very logical squares for them. And I think it's possible to understand why. I mean, now black plays the move rook to e8. And Meyer plays a great move, the computer's preferred move, bishop to f4. But it feels like a loose square to me. I mean, can't black just go knight to h5? Well, maybe not immediately because the d6 pawn is hanging. Or we can also argue that if the knight jumps to h5, we're just going to go back to e3 and we have misplaced the knight. But it just feels, you know, a little bit uncomfortable putting the bishop on a somewhat exposed square. But it's actually a very good one. And there's no way you can sort of punish it immediately in any way. Feller goes knight c5, just well, sort of putting pressure on the e4 pawn, and we defend it with the queen. Now the next thing that feels a little bit uncomfortable, right, is that, well, this knight on d4 is unprotected. For instance, can't black just take on e4? No, he can't, because after knight takes e4, bishop takes d4, there is this very strong move, bishop to g5. It threatens the queen, and also starts to really exploit the weaknesses of the dark square. For instance, well, you can't play the move f6 because bishop takes f6 wins immediately, and there is this, well, you take here, but we're gonna pick up the rook on e8. It's just easily winning. So after bishop g5, you have to go queen d7, but knight f6 check, and while, sure, we are pawn down here, this is just a tremendous compensation. This long diagonal, and I cannot prove that white is winning, but white is much better in this situation. So things are actually under control with having pieces like this. It just feels wrong to me. I mean, also, let's say knight h5. It's a double attack, right? Sure, but it doesn't matter. We will play bishop e3, and now, well, we can actually stand on the e3 square because this knight is no longer attacking the e4 pawn as it was before. So I think the way one has to understand it is that white is trying to set up sort of, well, to develop and bring his pieces into play, and then he will expand later. And Maya just does this in exemplary fashion. Feller goes knight to g4. Well, the first start, it threatens like this, but also it starts, well, putting the knight on this square. The next move from Maya is quite noteworthy. It's not like there's anything particularly wrong with rook a to d1, but the author says that after queen f6, it's a little bit uncomfortable, where, I mean, there's a threat against this bishop, and it can't go to e3, right? And he says that if you go bishop g3, maybe black can start something like h5 and create some kind of counterplay. But Maya chooses just this interesting move. He plays queen to d2, so he's actually happily started to go to c2 and then ended up on the d2 square. But his argument is that, well, on c2 he was mainly standing to protect this pawn on e4. And now with the knight having jumped to g4, well, it doesn't need to stand on this somewhat inferior square. I mean, on d2, well, it's defending the knight on d4. It's also putting indirect pressure on this pawn. It's also connecting up with the bishop on f4. So actually, it's a very nice square. The author says that the reason perhaps this move was not so popular was that at some point it was thought that black could play the move bishop to e5, and after h3 an exchange like this, and knight to e5, let's say rook a d1, queen to b6. But nowadays, well, this threat against b2 is not considered too serious. He says that you go queen g3, and if queen takes b2, f4 gives a huge initiative. Well, this being the basic point, and d6 is collapsing. I think, sure, that is something concrete. We want to learn more about the structure in general, so it matters less to us. So, black goes knight to e5, white goes rook a to d1, and black goes queen to b6. Now, at least, I start to grasp consensually that white is close to having an ideal setup, right? I mean, all these pieces feels to be on the right squares. This bishop, a little bit less so, but my problem is I can't go bishop e3 because knight g4 will then attack it. So white plays the move h3, and after a5, bishop to e3. I mean, now basically I feel, okay, this is exactly how it should be. I mean, sure, white played some artificial moves, but now his position is extremely harmonious and he's ready to expand. We have a bishop on f1 here, and it came from e2, right? It is very similar to King's Indians with g3, where we will have a bishop on g2, and there will be similar structural issues, and white will try to do it in a similar way. There will be some differences as well, of course, particularly the c4 pawn would be weaker with no bishop on f1 to defend it, right? But anyway, a typical move for black would be something like queen to b4, trying to have counterplay like this. But the author says here, it doesn't really work, because we can just go queen c1. And of course you can't take on c4 because we have the move a3. And the queen doesn't have a square that defends the c4 knight, and white is just winning a piece. So here it's actually already pretty difficult for black to make a reasonable move. Well, he starts moving around. He goes knight to d7. Now, well, I said that the d2 square was optimal, c2 was not. But, well, now the rook is in the d file, and perhaps it's reasonable to get a little bit out of the way. So queen c2 happens, a6. White actually expands with f4. The queen goes to b4, bishop f2, and knight b6, creating at least some threat against this pawn. The next move I also really like from white. He plays the move a3, and queen a5. When I say I really like it, is that, well, it's anti-positional to some extent. We have weakened the b3 square, but we have kicked the queen back to a5, and we are basically saying, sure, I'm weakening the b3 square, but I'm creating a solid structure on the queen side, mainly depriving you of counterplay, and then I'm gonna have a free go at the king side. Sure, this is not ideal for black on this side of the board, but I can control it, and chess is a game of give and take, and I'm willing to give you this because my attack is so much stronger. And Maya does it very well, and the computer approves of it. g4 is a very strong move. He's just trying to grab space on this king side. Black has sort of put most of his pieces somewhat inefficiently on the queen side, and this gives us a considerable free rein to expand on the king side. There's simply, well, there's nothing here that can be used to punish white for weaknesses. So it's not weakening, it's gaining space, it's attacking. The game was bishop to d7. The author says, you know, maybe knight b to d7, at least to avoid what happens in the game. But white is still better after a move like f3. But in the game, we saw bishop to d7. And this made white make another very exemplary move, and quite a surprising one. The move f5. The reason it's surprising is that, well, it really weakens the e5 square. But this bishop is in the way, so you can't go, let's say, knight d7 to e5, right? It's gonna take considerable amount of time. And else, well, this just grabs space, and well, we'll see it after, let's say, the game was rook a d8, bishop to h4. You can start attacking in a sort of certain way. Well, they repeated once, but here he played the move knight to f3. So he's trying to, well, both open up for the rook attacking this pawn on d6, which is a weak point in this structure because, well, the king's Indian bishop ideally wants to be on g7, but this means that the d6 pawn has to be defended somewhat artificially. Till now, there has always been this knight on d4 in the way for attacking it, but now it moves away, and it also moves in, well, potentially attacking on g5 on the king side because, well, as I mentioned already, the black pieces are so heavily concentrated on the queen side that actually the black king potentially can become into danger. The game was knight to b3. Sure, well, there's nothing to say. It's a beautiful square, and black has managed gaining something, but chess is a give and take, and this thing doesn't really matter. So queen to f2. Well, I mean, you couldn't take on d6 immediately. Of course, that would be a disaster because of a simple check winning the rook. But okay, that is just trivial. So queen f2, it sort of both tees up towards the kingside attack, but it also threatens rook takes d6 immediately. Black had to go bishop to f8. The game was king h1. And now, after queen c5, well, yeah, Maya plays the move e5, and although he later wins, black would kind of be okay here. The author points to that queen d2 basically is just winning for white. The threat is something like bishop to g3, starting to attack the pawn here, and there's no reasonable way to defend it. The computer says in the neighborhood of +3 here, and I think, no, I really want to keep this a clean, beautiful model game of how white should play this position, so I think we should finish it here. But I'm just so impressed with Maya's play and almost upset that I'm an older generation than Maya, because else I could have started this game and not had these doubts, because for me, you know, I just felt that these pieces are clumsy, I don't know where to put my pieces. After the bishop on f4, I would get nervous that it's hanging and so on and so forth. But I think here it's explained in a very logical manner, and we see that, well, white's space matters, and that eventually, well, he would build this formation, which just, I mean, here, everything makes perfect sense for me. White is perfectly centralized. He's ready to push that black pieces back, and while Maya messed it up a little bit in the end, at least for me, it brought complete clarity onto how should White play this structure under ideal circumstances. And I hope, I hope it also really helps you to understand what is White's potential and how can it be achieved. And I thought we saw this nice maneuvers with both the bishop and the queen going a little bit back and forth. But while it seemed to be losing a bit of time, we should also remember that, both the black knights and queens were sort of jumping around, almost desperately trying to create some counterplay. So White was doing an amazing job of suppressing the black's counterplay while still managing to release the white potential. So I think, I've mentioned it several times, but I'm really impressed by this game. Our next game is Malakhov against Yobava. Basically, Malakhov is this refined, cautious, positional player, and the Yobava is this extravagant, provocative attacking player. I mean, you don't get better clashes like this, right? Yobava has just played the move c6 and a6, and he wants to play the move b5. Well, for sure. Malakhov doesn't allow that, so he plays the move a4. But now Yobava plays a5, and he's basically saying, I mean, you have massively weakened your square on b4, and I will exploit that by rerouting my knight here. And, that is true. He has achieved that. But Malakhov doesn't care so much. He just plays h3, knight to a6, bishop to e3. He's just happy having his broad center and saying, okay, you got one b4 square. I'll kind of have to live with that. So Yobava have to sort of find a way to make sense of his position. So he goes knight d7, queen d2, e5. Well, basically, he's trying to counter the influence in the center, right? It's important to understand now that d5, while perhaps not being better for black, it's a pretty wrong move to do in this position. I mean, here, black would play something like knight c5, or perhaps he could even play the move f5 immediately, and somehow the white position makes quite less sense. No, white actually don't want to block the center and gain more space. White want to have an open center, the sort of the theme of this chapter. Malakhov just develops with rook a to d1. I think the computer was suggesting that even a move like f4 was also pretty reasonable here, just gaining space and creating even more tension in the center. But rook a1 is very reasonable, and Yobava took on d4, and Malakhov took back with the knight. Now, Yobava, as I said, is really extremely provocative, and what he does is perfectly logical in many ways, but it suffers from the same thing as we saw in the previous game, that black is now going to concentrate a lot of his forces on the queen side to create some kind of counterplay. And, it becomes the same trade-off as, sure, black has won access to the b4 square, but at the price of quite some central issues. And the same is going to happen now. So knight to d to c5. And I think a beautiful move. Bishop to b1. Why do I find it beautiful? Well, I mean, this bishop, it generally looks stupid, right? What is this bishop doing on b1? Is it going to have any future there? I mean, normally we would have it on e2 or on g2. This makes a lot of sense. On b1, what can we say? Well, sure, it helps perhaps stopping f5 because we can take. But it's more like on b1, it's out of the way, but still being useful. It has some kind of potential in this diagonal, but also it's just beautifully out of the way. And I think it also forces the black's knight to somehow use quite some attention of keeping it out of the way. Basically, black's idea has been, we want to misplace this bishop on b1. We want to dominate it with a knight on b4, for instance. But yes, you're going to achieve that, but I'm going to get something else. And we will see that this something else is really powerful here. Yobava goes queen to b6. I think he thought that, yeah, I can put my knight here, but, again, it just looks, it looks nice. But I have these two knights, but, the only function is sort of harassing this bishop, but they don't really do anything else. If I bring out my queen to b4, at least I'm starting to pounce on some weaknesses, right? So Malakoff goes f4 and queen to b4 happens. And it's correct. There is a threat of queen takes c4. I mean, I would almost argue if you take on c4, well, we're going to play bishop a2 and we're going to get some attack for our pawn at least. But Malakoff, while I described him as very cautious and very, well, conservative is almost a mild word for Malakoff, he do also carry some punch. And he plays the move f5. We saw it exactly in the previous game as well, that while yes, it does weaken the e5 square. It makes this bishop better. But we have more ambitious plans. We basically, well, we are considering playing a move like f6 at some point to block your bishop to h8. Or we're gonna try to, let's say, play bishop h6 and weaken your king side and then give mate. I mean, we are not just playing for, well, true, pretty valuable things as a square like e5. But here we actually have, well, literally all our pieces are involved in the attack. Even this bishop on b1 starts to make quite some sense, right? Well, not too unexpectedly, Jobava goes all in. He takes on a4. The author says this is too much. He says the best move is knight to d7. I mean, at least trying to aim for the e5 square, but he also says that after a move like bishop h6, we want to exchange on g7, and he says knight f6. We're going to do exactly that and play the move queen to f4. And generally, it's a very difficult situation for black. But at least, well, we managed to get the knight back to the defense, and things are not too bad. But, well, the computer says white is clearly better here, and there's not much you can do about that. For our purposes, Jobava can always be counted for making things instructive for one side or the other. He takes on a4. And while, well, I have sort of raised the sort of warnings that white is going to do something on the king side. That's perhaps what actually tricked Jobava, because, well, yeah, white is not that one-dimensional. He plays f6 first, blocking in the bishop, but after bishop h8, he has this very nice move, knight to c2. It threatens the queen, and the queen has to keep an eye on the knight. So the only square is queen to b3. Then there is bishop a2, which basically forces the queen away for protecting this knight. So he has to take on b2 in order to meet knight takes a4 with queen takes a2. But in this position there is knight to b6. And the problem is, well, the game was bishop to e6, is that, you know, we are not going to take this exchange. No, the relevant point is that it defends these pawns backwards. And this means that there is rook a1, queen to b3, and now rook a3 is possible, queen b2, bishop d4, and the queen on b2 is trapped, so Jobava resigned. I think, well, a brilliant game by Malakoff. Perhaps he was pushed a bit towards it by Jobava's provocations, but also, I mean, if you want to be able to play cautious chess without being, you know, really bullied by creative players like Jobava, you have to make an example now and then. And, well, to put it mild, Malakoff made quite some example here, right? There is several things I pretty much like. I think for a start, this idea of playing a6 responding with a5, well, it should be understood as double edge. It's not as bad for black as it seems here, but it is not a crucial weakness of the b4 square. It's a trade-off where white gets central control. He avoids black undermining with b5 for the expense of this b4 square. Then I thought it's pretty instructive that white is not closing the center. On the contrary, he's encouraging an open center despite that it somehow minimizes his space edge, but he gains attacking prospects on the king's side. And, well, I think I made it clear, this move bishop b1. I think it's cool that a piece can be actually quite useful while having no place to go and no obvious direct prospects. But it's like, I think it was Schuber who said in a book that it's a bad bishop protecting a bad pawn, but for good reasons. I don't know if it translates fully to this, but there is quite some truth in it, that it is an important piece. And I cannot fully say, well, you know, what is it doing? Well, it stands there and it's out of the way, but it has considerable influence, and that's more or less it. And then, well, we saw again this powerful move f5, that while giving up the e5 square, It's something that you generally don't want to do when black has put so much firepower on the queen side. Well, we attack where they are weakest, and we saw how it worked out brilliantly here. So I think, well, a very impressive game by Malakoff, no doubts. This is Bauer against McShane from Germany in 2003. I think at first sight it looks like a pretty normal position, right? That well, the black knights are where they normally are, so are the bishops and even the rook, right? But perhaps what sort of is a little bit odd is the queen on h4, but actually it is pretty active there. Normally we have it sort of floating around on the b6 square, but on h4 it is kind of active. What also springs to mind is, well, this knight on d2. Wouldn't we rather have it on d4? I would say so to a certain extent. So it gives sort of the impression that black is doing pretty okay here. The question is, well, what to do next? I mean, whites do have some spatial edge, and maybe he would play a move like knight f3 next to sort of initiate exchanges. McShane is very energetic here. He plays a nice move. He plays the move f5. He sort of understands that temporarily it's not like the white position is fully out of order, but it's a little bit imbalanced, and now is the time to strike. I think it does carry the threat of f4. It's not like it wins a piece. Well, let me make a sort of dummy move here by a3, and then after the move f4, white can go g3. It even sort of removes this dangerous pawns on f4, but after takes, queen f6, I think black is comfortably better here. We have weakened the white king side a bit. I say a bit because it's not massively, but somehow it feels more uncomfortable. There is also, let's say, some pressure with the sort of bishop and queen towards the knight on c3, which is, well, somewhat unprotected in that way. So it is uncomfortable. We have threats like knight d4. I think black is comfortably slightly better here in this. So, well, you can't take on f5 either, right? We take back with the bishop and the queen has to go somewhere, and then knight d3 is just a fork. So it is not fully pleasant. What Bauer chose to do was to play the move f4, which forces the black knight back from e5 to d7. But the f4 pawn is clumsy, right? Or ugly to some extent. It's, well, to call it a weakness is a little bit much, but what should you do here? Actually, the computer says that bishop f3 is the most reasonable move. Just defending the pawn on e4, creating a little bit more of harmony. Maybe we will play g3 next, something like that. I'm not at all saying white is better. I'm not even claiming that white is equal here. For instance, well, black could just play a useful move like rook e7, doubling the e-file, and black is certainly comfortable. But it would be a better way to deal with it, probably. In the game was knight to f3, and McShane played queen to e7. The author says it's just pleasant for black. I don't know, maybe there is even the threat of bishop takes c3 and we're going to take a pawn on e4, and while white is going to have the pair of bishops, it doesn't look to be that terrifying here. But what else can you do? I mean, well, it's a problem. You can't take on f5, obviously, because we're going to take back and we're going to win this piece on e3. The author says probably best is knight g5, and then something like takes on e4, bishop f5. Well, now you have to take on c5 and play the move bishop f3. And white is not particularly losing here. Actually, well, black probably has to do queen f8 and sort of threaten to take on e4 followed by queen takes f4 to keep some kind of edge. I mean, there is the pair of bishops here, and obviously the white sort of spatial advantage has disappeared. It's more like he's in defensive mode, but he should be able to defend quite reasonably here. But, well, black has mini outplayed him, I would argue. And yeah, I think a pretty instructive thing. I mean, the move f5 here, I think is quite impressive. Yes, of course, it's the typical moves in the King's Indian, but not really under these circumstances, right? We normally do it with a pawn on e5 to do an attack. Here it's more to, well, somehow insinuate this, but more to, I would say, put pressure on this central constellation. And here, while in the other examples we have seen these knights here being pushed back, here actually well, they also get pushed back, but they really create sort of white weaknesses here. So I think a good comeback for black, and a very nice game by McShane here. A very sort of typical generic position. I mean, this is a g3 King's Indian, the bishop is on g2, but we have our open center here. And, well, both sides has developed quite logically. Perhaps it's a little bit of a favorable version for black. Normally the rook would already be on d1, I would say, and perhaps also this bishop would be a little bit safer on f2. And this actually gives black some interesting possibilities. The game goes g5, which the author says is a pretty interesting move. And it is, but the computer gives a very nice tactical idea. It says, let's do like McShane, let's undermine with f5. Well, at first sight it looks, isn't it just hanging a pawn? But there is this beautiful small tactical idea. Knight takes g3. Well, the point is, obviously he has to take, but after takes, queen to g5. Check. We are forcing the king back to either f2 or h2. It really doesn't matter, because we will check on h4 and f4, and then we're going to win this bishop back on d4. So, king h2, queen f4 check, king to h1. Now we take the bishop, but actually the fireworks are not over yet, because, well, white can take on g6, and our king starts feeling, well, lonely or vulnerable. Sure, but so does white's king. We have another trick. Rook e1, bishop takes h3, and when he takes back, we're gonna go queen to h4, attacking on e1 and on h3. And after g8-7, king h8, the computer says, well, this is an equal position. So, well, nice fireworks, but still ending up in inequality, right? Anyway, f5, a cool tactical move, but maybe perhaps a little bit more random in a way. The game with g5 is very interesting. It's a very double-edged, and I would say, somewhat suspicious move. The author says that Brunel acts in a too passive way. He said that queen d2 would be the right move, sort of to immediately put pressure on this pawn, right? And that will force you to play h6. And now we could go rook a d1 when we have a much better version of what's going to happen in the game. But Brunel played more sort of stereotypically. He played the move rook a to d1. He just sort of let me finish developments. Is this g5 move really any kind of relevant attack? Well, it is to some extent, because black actually plays this interesting move, bishop to e5. And, well, it just threatens the pawn on g3. So bishop f2 happened, and queen to f6. Now, well, black has some kind of harmony, right? I mean, it's like the pieces like this. It's difficult to sort of push them away with f4, and when they stand like this, it makes kind of sense. And yes, we have weakened the f5 square, but white cannot really exploit it, I would say. So Brunel plays nice c to e2, a nice sort of reinforcing move, looking in the direction of the g3 pawn, but also reinforcing the knight on d4. The game was a5, queen d2, king h8, sort of getting ready for activities in the g file, and then rook g1, rook g8 happens. Now, again, unfortunately, Brunel plays too passively. He should really have played the move bishop to e3. The point is that, well, there is actually, in reality, a threat of f4 now. So if you go rook g6, then f4 kind of wins a piece. It's not like the back position is particularly bad. You can go queen e7, and if f4, you will be able to retreat backwards. But after rook df1, rook g6, bishop e3, suddenly black is in time to play the move rook a to g8, and you can't go f4 anymore, because the black power in the g line would be very decisive. I think most likely the solution is something like this, and well, fe5, there is obviously checkmate on g2 next, right? Just to flash a little bit of tactical skills here. So rook a g8 is a nice move. The author says that, well, queen takes a5. Is that possible? No, there is a very beautiful tactical trick again, the same one actually. Knight takes g3, knight takes g3, check, and after king to d3, then very beautiful move, queen e5 check. Well, this king have to move. Obviously you can't play f4, because we're going to take with the double check and e3 hanging. And after king f2, well, knight takes e4, fe4, and then queen takes a5. The queen is hanging like this, and well, black has a queen for 2 pieces and is easily winning. So I think a beautiful and unusual tactic. We also saw another very interesting tactic like this sequence, right? But in general, we got to discuss this position a bit. And well, as I said, when I see it the first time, it looks like white is somewhat underdeveloped, and well, this rook should really be on d1, the bishop on f2. Then white is both more solid, g3 better protected, and the black tricks are not really gonna work. When we saw here in the game that black had actually several interesting plans based on white being somewhat lacking in development. So I think an interesting example for black, but also showing that, well, even when this g5 happened and black won a nice game, we saw that white could actually, with a bit of care, still have a very pleasant position, which I guess, again, kind of gives away that even in just a decent version, it is pretty pleasant for white at times. This is Arutinian against Yefimenko, and a pretty standard King's Indian position. Black has sort of exchanged on d4, and we have gotten this typically open King's Indian structure we're debating in this chapter. What perhaps comes a little bit to mind is this bishop on d3 being slightly, maybe atypically placed, but quite decent. The question is, what should black do now? Yefimenko does it very well. He starts by playing h6, asking a question to this bishop. The bishop backs to the f4 square, which is a nice square in this structure. And as usual, I get a little bit nervous seeing knight h5 attacking the bishop, and this bishop attacks my knight. But after bishop e3, everything is sort of connected, and well, I would argue that perhaps knight h5 has been played a little bit too early. So this is nothing to worry about here. A typical move perhaps could be knight to d7, attacking this knight. But here, probably white could put the bishop back to f1, where it's very usefully placed, and I think white is just pleasantly better here. Yefimenko goes knight to c5, and this poses a question to the bishop on d3. I don't know if knight takes d3 is a huge threat, but it does sort of, well, gain the pair of bishops for black. And the problem for white is that the usual square, bishop f1, is just not possible. You can just take on e4, right, winning a pawn. So the bishop has to go to c2. It's not necessarily a bad square at all. If anything, you could argue, perhaps, isn't the bishop more useful on f1 than on c2 than on f1? Maybe it is in terms of activity, but on f1, I would say it helps protecting the king. So I'm not too sure about the c2 square, but nothing particularly wrong with it at least. Now Yefimenko thinks the timing is right for knight h5, because after bishop e3 he has a strong reply ready. He plays the move knight to e6. I guess he thinks, let's say, exchanges are somewhat helpful for him because he has the more cramped position, but also it is a little bit awkward for white to make a move in this position. I mean, the typical move would be, let's say, queen to d2, just developing healthily. But then black has a very interesting resource. He can take on d4 with the bishop, giving up the pair of bishops, but knight playing knight to e to f4. And suddenly threats like, let's say, queen g5 or queen h4 starts appearing. And here we see that this bishop on c2 is actually lacking for the defense of the king's side. So this is, I'm not saying things are very bad. I mean, the author says that you should go king to h2, and after queen h4, this funny move, rook to h1, actually. And, well, this position is complex. He gives an interesting line. He says knight g2, and after bishop h3, knight f4 check, you can sacrifice the queen with a very weird position with 3 pieces for a queen. And he says it's sort of probably very dynamically balanced. But, well, bishop takes d4, it's understandable that black sort of shouldn't be allowed this kind of activity that early. Another way to deal with the position could be knight f3. But then knight g5 is quite sort of making use of this pawn here, and it's also creating some kind of awkward tension, I would say, in the neighborhood of the white king. Maybe the best move is this very surprising move, knight to f5. It's very understandable that white didn't spot this tactic, because after takes, at first sight it looks like, sure, white is just going to regain the piece on h5. But actually there is this funny move, knight to d4. And, well, if you take on h5, we're going to take on c2. And if you take on d4, then we're going to take on e1 and take back on d4. So black just looks like winning a piece. But the computer says, no, you can play the move bishop to e4. And now you're renewing the threat of bishop takes d4, and you still have queen takes h5. So this is ending up in a complicated position where black actually has to play the move knight takes f5 to sort of stay in the game. But nothing is particularly bad for black, and quite interesting and complicated. But white somehow, well, thought these things probably too tricky in a way, and tried to go for simplicity and just took on e6. But I think the exchange has quite helped black right now. Somehow the bishops looks very harmonious, and there is not two sort of black knights that are tripping over each other. So when you have less space, an exchange is generally helpful. Probably now the best thing would be to sort of reroute this bishop back to f1. I mean, the immediate problem, of course, is that this pawn on c4 is hanging, right? White decided to be more ambitious and put the bishop on b3. In general, I think it looks pretty artificial somehow, right, having the bishop on b3. It doesn't do much else than shooting into this pawn, and for sure it keeps it defended, but it looks weird there. Black reacted in a very nice way. He played the move bishop to e5. He just wants to, well, control the f4 square and also bring the queen to h4, sort of intensifying moderate pressure around the white king. And here this bishop, well, it should really have been on the f1 square to help the defend. It's true that it's a pawn sacrifice. White can take on h6, but after the move queen h4, black already has massive compensation. The author says that best is queen d2, and now black has a pleasant choice between either, let's say, playing knight to f4, and positions like this is just nice positional compensation, or he could also force a draw basically by sacrificing on h3, and after take here we are threatening bishop to h2, followed by a discovery winning something, probably the queen, and white will have to play the move f4 here to have the queen connecting in this direction. But now there is a nice move bishop to d4 check, and after it takes, it's a perpetual. If you go to h1, we're just gonna check on h3, and it's an immediate perpetual. And if you play king f1, we have a nice move queen to f3. And if you choose not to go back to g1, but play queen f2 trying to win, well, you actually made it next move. So bishop h6 was actually possible, and you could probably still, well, kind of force a draw by white. But white is just trying to play sensible moves, goes queen f3, but now he's actually much, much worse. And why, we will see after the next move. So rook a d1. It still looks like white has a pretty decent position. Sure, this bishop is awkward, but else it's all nice and centralized. But all this changes with the next move for black. g5 is a brilliant move. It looks weird, right? We have a queen basically self-blocking itself by playing the move g5. But it's only temporary. We want to push g4 next, and this actually will do pretty horrible things to the white king on g1, right? After g4, the h file will open, and we're going to enter the h2 square. So in this position, it's a pretty desperate situation for white already. The author said after bishop g4, then g4, basically there's no way else than allowing to take on h3 next with a clear h4 for black. So the sort of white chose in the game to go g4. It's obvious desperation, but there was no really good solution. And after knight f4, he took back with the pawn. And here, well, I guess he's panicking over king h7, rook g8. So he chose to play the move c5, but after taking on b3 and taking on c5, black just has a very healthy extra pawn. And, well, the author says that the rest of the game has really no relevance for our sort of the subject, and I think that's fair enough. But I thought a strong example from black's perspective. we shouldn't overestimate black's position. I mean, talking about a black edge here already is way too much, but he manages to sort of counter white's central edge in a very nice way. And I would say knight c5, and then especially, well, this sort of kicking off the bishop, and then move knight e6 is very much key. We see that, well, white doesn't have the same harmony as we saw in earlier situations. I mean, imagine this bishop being on f1 and the queen on d2. We would feel a much bigger sense of control. And this black managed to actually exploit excellently. And, well, of course, well, bishop e5, and then this idea of pushing g5 is very noteworthy, but perhaps somewhat specific. But, well, we got to see black's potential here if white goes a little bit astray. And I think a very impressive game by Yefremenko, right? We are finishing off this chapter with a game from our author Floris Rias, who has the black pieces against Jan Elvest. I think it's a great example because it's a very generic version of this pawn structure, and we get to see the sort of plans for white especially, and how black gets into some kind of structural difficulties. I guess at first sight it looks a little bit weird. I mean, there is a knight on a6, a queen on e8, and perhaps also the knight on g4 looks like they're floating a little bit around. But things will start to normalize soon. First white plays the move h3. And before sort of removing the knight from g4, black flicks in the nice move h6, basically making sure he attacks the bishop and it cannot retreat to e3 because the knight is on g4. So white has to go the move bishop to c1, but actually it's less bad than it seems. Sure, this bishop has gone back and forth, but it will return to the e3 square eventually, and there's nothing black can really do about it now. So black also has to retreat with knight f6, and white does a nice sort of step back with bishop to f1. The author makes the point that this is already a pretty uncomfortable position for black, and I think that's an important point to understand, that while King's Indian positions in general offer good counterplay for black, but they have to be played in a somewhat specific way. I mean, here white is generally just having this pleasant center, and it's hard for black to create any kind of counterplay. I mean, well, normally sometimes here you would play the move bishop to g4 to be able to take on d4 next, but well, with a pawn on h3, obviously you can't do that. And while perhaps the black's position looks pretty solid here, there's very little he can do of positive things. He tries to move knight to h5. I mean, at least it looks nice, right? It thinks maybe you can jump in this direction. Well, the author says actually it's kind of a bluff. You could just go bishop e3 now, but Elvest chooses to take it seriously, and it's a very sensible move, just making sure this knight stays out of play. Black makes useful moves for a while, and so does white. And I think here, well, yeah, you are threatening the pawn on h6, right, and black chooses to defend it. Here, I think the situation is that both players has developed their pieces as normally they can, and here we get to some kind of standstill. I mean, I remember in my youth that, well, getting to around here felt easy and natural, right? All my pieces, at least these pieces, seems in pretty optimal situation. They are just on beautiful squares. This bishop on f1, perhaps you can argue, is a little bit passive, but it does defend in both directions and keeps a3 and c4 protected. And also on f1, it's out of the way. If on e2 or d3, it would be blocking something. So white has this very harmonious position. The question is what to do about it. Elvest's solution is beautiful and simple. He just takes space. He plays the move b4. I guess there in my youth I would be a little bit sort of, it would be difficult to play the move b4. What's the idea of it? And it also, you know, it's in the direction of the queen. Isn't it a weakness? No, it's not a weakness. I mean, it's just grabbing useful space. I mean, it's like there is some space up for grabs on the queen side, and white literally chooses to grab it. And, well, who knows, maybe next we will push it to b5. But in general, we just think that, well, it's nice to have extra space, and we pass on the move to black. What are you gonna do? And black has no reasonable answer. I mean, there's no way black can start putting up some kind of attack. I mean, if you start doing f5, you're just going to weaken your own king without putting up any kind of reasonable threats towards the white position. So here, Flores Reyes chooses to sort of enter our structure. He takes on d4, and now we get this open center that's sort of the subject of this chapter. Edelweiss takes back in a very typical fashion with the knight, but actually taking back with the bishop was also quite reasonable. Flores Reyes argues that, sure, I mean, there will be an exchange of a set of bishops, and in general, that should sort of help the defending side. But this bishop on g7 is sort of the King's Indian bishop. It's the one that's supposed to be active, and it also a little bit helps securing the king. So there is very much a case for actually exchanging it. But taking with the knight, there is nothing wrong with at all. Here, our author says that the relatively best would probably be playing along sort of the style of Yefimenko, to do knight e6 and try to do some useful exchanges. We are here, I mean, Yefimenko did it in an aggressive fashion. Here we are very much talking about limiting damage, trying to only be somewhat worse. But, well, for instance, let's say white can take an e6, black takes back, we go rook d1, we attack the d6 pawn, black defends it, and now we could develop normally, or we could also do like we saw Maya do in a game, try and gain space on the king's side with g4 followed by f4. The author quite likes this. He thinks that, well, this is a relevant space grab. It's more sort of compromising than this space grab here. I mean, here you are weakening squares in front of your king, but he thinks it's quite worth it that you get this extra space. And the computer seems to agree. So, well, there is reason to trust them. Even so, it feels a little bit uncomfortable, but also in a nice, ambitious way, I would say. And I think it is somewhat noteworthy. But knight e6 would be a much better move than what happens in the game. The game saw the move a5. And it's an extremely logical move and very typical of this King's Indian that black tries to open the a file. Edelweiss obliged black in that plan, and that's a huge mistake. A much better move would be to play the move b5 in this position. It's a typical mistake to make from white's perspective, because I guess this move, it looks a little bit weird, right? We are weakening the c5 square, but there's just no realistic way black can sort of use that. Well, and also, what should black do? We are actually threatening to take a pawn on c6. If you play c5, we have to retreat with the knight, but the pawn on d6 has become weak, and maybe we are threatening b6 followed by knight d5 as well. So this is a very awkward situation. The author says perhaps you should go knight e6. The idea is that you indirectly defend here because you can take on d4 and take back on c6 later. And he says that probably here white should take on e6. Again, just attack the pawn on d6, and when black defends it, a move like knight a4 is very nice. In the game, we will see activity for black in the a file. Here it's very, very different. The a file is closed, and this knight can jump to the b6 square. White is just much better here. He has a lot of active options. He can sort of poke at different weaknesses in the black position. And black, on the other hand, has a very limited counterplay. So white is clearly better here, no doubt. And I think the move b5 is very instructive. But a3 is typical. And, well, I think it's typical because quite often this is the best option white has. The problem is that it allows quite some counterplay for black. So Flores Reyes opens the a file and put the rook on a3. And it's a typical sort of King's Indian theme to flick the rook in here. It attacks in this direction. I think there is a very famous game where Bronstein is doing it successfully, for instance. It's not like, you know, the rook is sort of penetrating on a3 with huge power, but it's standing there and it's annoying. And it's not easy to get rid of. For instance, if you go knight c2, well, you can't. c3 is hanging, right? Rook a1, well, there's a nice little trick then. Then you take on c3 and you play the move c5, and you're actually going to get 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn, which is quite favorable. yes, white can push back the rook with queen b2, but after rook a8, black is just happy that this queen is pretty awkwardly placed on b2. It doesn't really connect with anything, and well, also being in this diagonal can be somewhat frustrating. So Ylvis just decided to leave the rook on g2 and play sort of on a3 and play the move bishop g2 instead. But black then starts to sort of make exchanges, and somehow the black position has improved quite considerably. I mean, mainly this rook who was stuck on a8 has found a purpose on a3, and that the rook is not stuck on a8 means also that the bishop on c8 is much less in the way. On c8, with a rook on a8, it's sort of blocking the coordination between the two rooks, right? But now it feels less guilty in just standing on the c8 square. Actually, it's a nice solid square for it. So after knight e6, there was an exchange like this. And, well, Ylvis, being the quite higher rated player, tries in an ambitious way to put pressure. So he starts with g4, the knight goes back, bishop f4, attacking the pawn on d6. But black is just defending like this. And, well, white sort of keeps going forward. He tries to move knight to d5. It's a not typical move. I mean, the idea is that if you take it, we're going to take back with the pawn. There's a pin in the e-file, so we're going to get the pair of bishops, and we're going to ruin the black pawn structure. Everything is great. But as they say, chess is not checkers. You don't have to take. So queen f8 is nice. It makes sure that when we take on f6, there is nothing hanging on h6 because the queen is defending, right? So, well, white has to go back. And, yeah, now black goes back with the knight on e8. It can look extremely passive, but actually it's just connecting sort of to the d6 pawn defending and making sure the rook can go to a8. However, the author says that here, probably he did it a bit too passively. It would have been better to play the move h5 first, to basically sort of force this inclusion of g5 and then playing the move knight to e8. And he thinks having the pawns here and here, it somewhat favors black, which seems reasonable. I mean, of course, white has some space, but it's loosening his pawn structure to some extent. I don't think it's a major point, but it's a relevant one nonetheless. Anyway, he played the move knight to e8, rook ed1, and rook a8. And I think now, well, black just has a pretty beautiful position. All his pieces actually have quite some function. Well, especially, of course, there is activity in the A file, not in a deadly sense, but in a sense that there is always a bunch of counterplay there. Well, rook a2 will be an interpolation at times, and so on and so forth. And also, I mean, this knight on e8 I really like. It connects to the d6 pawns and make it defended. And while for sure it's passive, it's being as useful as it can. And it's basically, well, by being passive itself, it makes other pieces of black pretty active. You could take on d6, but then, well, black actually has the nice move bishop to f8, and he's going to get the b4 pawn, right? So this is going to end up nicely for black. Ylvis chose to play the move bishop g3. The queen was kicked, and queen e1. And now the author played the move g5. It's not a bad move, but it's a, well, compromising one. You're basically trying to say that, well, we want bishop e5, we want control of the dark squares, and we're not too worried that you get the white squares. The computer is not a huge fan of it. The computer suggests a better move, and, well, the author calls it a more solid one, but it's actually just a better move. It's the move queen h8. I think it's really beautiful. Well, again, I keep going back to Larsen, but he was showing me some example with this as well, right? It looks, of course, weird to have a battery like this with the queen on h8, but actually it sort of exerts tremendous influence in this diagonal. It's hard for white to do something great against it. Let's say if you do f4, well, we'll do bishop b2, attack your rook, and if you go rook b1, we're going to stand on d4, where we suddenly attack in this direction, and there's the threat of bishop takes c4 as well. And so it's not only a passive construction, it's actually quite active. And I think I will end both the game and the chapter here, because, well, getting to finish it off with a beautiful move like queen h8, I really, no, that's, I mean, I'm a sucker for these kind of moves. That's what makes chess so beautiful at times, right? Some atypical moves, but still in a very harmonious way. And I think a great example, because we saw how White would develop his initiative in this kind of positions, right? I mean, for me, something like this is very much a key position, because White has everything in good order. And then I thought Elvis very cleverly started to play the move b4 and grab space. And of course, also after a5, I think it's useful to understand that b5 is so much better a version than what happens in the game, because when the rook gets to a3, at least black starts having typical King's Indian counterplay. And while White perhaps might be sort of pleasantly better at times, at least black is getting sort of what he wants. But anyway, my idea was to end this chapter with the queen on h8, so I will do that and move on to the next one.